Yeah, what, three geezers down the route, right?
Three geezers down, yeah, exactly. So, although the first thing I did want to ask you actually is a little bit off piece, is we also do at the end of each podcast episode, we ask our guests or panelists these same 10 questions, and it kind of paints a picture as to what their kind of Porsche persuasion is. And one of the questions is, who is your 911 icon? It's not a car, it's geared towards a person. And these two said you. I think somebody else.
Kind of right there.
Well, yeah,
I'll take it.
So these two said you. I think another one of our guests has said you. You obviously were top 3 on the T911 21st Century Icons.
Whoa, on the podium, how about that?
Yeah, exactly. Behind Mr. AP, no less. So, I mean, it's not bad company to keep it. But yeah, I wanted to know, like, you know, what your reaction is to that, really, and like how that makes you feel.
Well, you know, on one hand, flattered. On the other hand, I'll joke about it and say you geezers has got way too much time on your hands to come up with these type of things. But I think if I break it down, I talk about this a little bit because it does come up. Obviously, not the Road to Redline top 3 podium, but people do ask this question quite often. And to me, I always say I'm just relatable. You know, I'm an enthusiast like everyone else. We all enjoy Porsche, right? You know, it's kind of my religion, my drug of choice. People like what I do, that's great. I'm not actually here to sell anyone anything. You know, sort of what separates me from other people is, you know, I'm an enthusiast like you guys. It's not a company like where I'm building customer cars and, you know, tuning stuff. So for me, I think my relatability really is, I'm not really any different to anyone else. I like chasing the cars. I like driving the cars. I like talking about them. So I think that's kind of how I sum it up. If people, you know, relate to me on that level is, hey, we all have the poster on the wall, right? We all have that dream. We all love the car for everything it brings, the drive, the camaraderie, the people, the tours, the events, the way it looks. So I just appreciate the support that people give me for what I do. And I don't overthink it. I'll leave it at that.
And on that kind of note as well, your Outlaw meets have kind of diversified, haven't they? It used to kind of be really Porsche centric, but now, and I think that's a good thing, is you champion anybody's welcome. You know, is that kind of a conscious thing? Is kind of diversify and involve an enthusiast community that's outside of Porsche?
Yeah, for sure. You know, I always say all true car enthusiasts share the same connection. You just pick your jug of choice, whatever car it is you're into. It's like I'm all excited. I bought that 1975 AMC Hornet 48 hours ago, and I've already made a video on it, and I wasn't even looking for it. So for me, you know, my background is, you know, I've got a Super B tattoo there. I actually don't have a Porsche tattoo. My background is, you know, I've owned a lot of different cars, whether it's American muscle cars, European sports cars, or Porsches. So for me, these outlaw gatherings kind of started on a whim, probably started at the Ace Cafe back in the day, and just sort of grew from there. But it was always a little bit for me, you know, the Porsche purist is always super Porsche centric, and I'm a car guy. I'm a Porsche guy, but I'm also a car guy. So the gatherings always were all a welcome. You know, there seems to be a lot of sort of elitist Porsche gatherings where it has to be a certain type of Porsche. And for me, people that relate to my story, kind of like what we're talking about, are just true car guys and enthusiasts. Yeah. So for me, it was never to sort of eliminate that sort of end of the car culture world. And then with my appearance in things like the Need for Speed game back in 2015, you know, it was a big car culture. So it didn't matter whether you're a Ken Block guy, a sport import tuner, a drift guy, a sports car guy, a hot rod guy, all are welcome. And for me, it's all about diversity of the culture. So that was why these outlaw gatherings kind of came out of, you know, I'd travel, someone would shoot me a message, hey, you know, I'd love to meet you for a beer or whatever. You know, to me, it was like, instead of trying to do a one-on-one thing, just do a gathering. To me, it's a way of meeting that culture in that city. And I've done them all over, from LA to Sydney, generally in some sort of industrial area under a bridge. But the common bond that really brings them all together is they're never over promoted. It's usually 48 hours before on the gram. You know, it's not this big deal where you got to submit a car and sign in and register and overblown, and some panel decides if you're cool enough to come or not. It's not what thing.
Yeah.
So to me, I think that relates back to the great equalizer. You know, all are welcome. You know, I think a true car guy likes every type of car. Absolutely. You know, Porsche is just one flavor of that. It's one slice of that cake. So that's really the story behind me doing these outlaw gatherings, is just a way to bring a lot of like-minded people together. And you really experience that culture. I did one in Miami that was awesome. I mean, everyone that I've done has been interesting on a certain level, and I've met a lot of great people through them. So that's all it is, really, just a shout out to let's get together for a couple of hours, kick some tires, tell some stories, and maybe go for a drive. And that's kind of my philosophy on everything that I do that's car related, whether it's Porsche centric or not.
How many do you think you've done now of those gatherings?
Oh, I don't know. I've lost count. At least 20. I mean, you know, I did one in Tokyo. I combined that with RWB and the Kayasan. The one in Sydney was awesome. I've done a couple in London, LA, New York, Miami. I did one in Switzerland. I did one in Colombia. I did one in Mexico City. And each one's kind of like a slightly different vibe, but the common thread is always the same. So I've probably done, I don't know, 20 of them all over, but they're always the same. It's 48-hour notice, and people generally tend to like them because I think of the diversity. But it's not this sort of cars and coffee mentality either. It's a bit more urban, a bit more gritty.
I think they really work because of the sort of pop-up like event about it. It's just, as you say, 48 hours before, and it just happens, and the right people turn up.
It's a bit more organic when it's like that, isn't it? I think it's not as forced.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I was traveling all the time. I was hardly ever in LA, visiting some interesting places. I did one in Berlin at the Olympic Coliseum. One of the best ones I did was in Hamburg. There were over 500 people there. But they're always really spontaneous. So I think that just sort of creates that spontaneous vibe of you don't overthink it. It's not like, oh, I've got to get my car ready for this event coming up in 3 months' time, which is fine. But mine were always just a little bit of a way I'm traveling. I want to meet people, and it's a great way to get everyone together in one location, and then things just sort of blossom from there. So that's the story behind the Outlaw Gallery.
Out of all those events and all those people and all those cars, like, was there any real standout cars that are really memorable that you just blew you away or really surprised you?
F40 Miami, surely.
What's that?
F40 Miami, surely.
Well, you took the words out of my mouth. The F40 Miami story came out of a Miami Outlaw gathering. I never thought I'd drive an F40. I put that in my top 5 intoxicating drives. We got pulled over by a cop at the end of it. We had no paperwork, no insurance, no state license. It was looking a little iffy. You know, we were doing some speeds maybe that were above the posted limit, but it just created this memorable moment, you know. So a lot of these things have created memorable moments and drives and people and connections and relationships and friendships. So that's kind of the best thing about them. But the F40 for sure was a big standout one. So that's been a memorable one, and that was back in 2016, 2017.
Did you frame the ticket? Is it on the wall somewhere?
Never got a ticket in the end. You know, we've been doing these blasts. My buddy Larry Chan was there shooting something for Speed Hunters. And it was like the final, let's go for one final drive. We were done. And it's the classic final drive that gets you. Yeah, we'd obviously drawn some attention. We came over the bridge. The cop was there. You know, and we literally, it was on dealer plates. We didn't have any paperwork in the car. And it was looking a little iffy. But in the end, we never got a ticket. So that one worked out pretty good.
Well, the last couple of years, as you said, you've lived out of a suitcase, really, haven't you? Traveled the world. By contrast, is it nice to have a bit of time at home in DTLA at the moment? Or would you rather be out and about?
Awesome. You know, I've been here sort of since early March. Hannah and I had an apartment in New York that we recently gave up. So Hannah's relocated to LA, which is great. She can work remotely from anywhere. So now we're living together after 3 years of a bi-coastal relationship. So that's a big plus that came out of COVID that we spoke about but hadn't planned. Happened organically. Everything for me happens organically. There's no plan. Everything that you guys have seen has sort of happened organically. But to specifically answer your question, I've kind of been on a creative role since March, whether it's making face masks or doing outlaw cooking shows or playing around with cars. And, you know, I've got back on this creative role that when I was traveling, as great as that was, living out of the 22-inch carry-on suitcase, hopping all over the world, it was great. But I'd sort of got to a point where the 530-second conversations, as I described that travel running into people, was sort of becoming a little repetitive. And so for me, being grounded in LA has enabled me to focus on things that I wanted to do but hadn't done because I was never in one place long enough. Couple of examples, you know, my book that came out in 2017 and then 2018 in German. I never had a US publishing book deal. So in the end, I negotiated the rights to my own book. Martin and I, the ghostwriter, are writing 2 new chapters, including some new footage, and we're going to release the book ourselves domestically in the States. It's now out of print, so you can't get it. So that was something I'd wanted to do for the past 18 months, but never focused on. And certain other things like rebooting the Urban Outlaw shop, you know, I'm focusing on getting that back up together. I'm focusing on trying to put together, I've been doing all this great stuff, Amelia, driving all over the world, the things you've seen, but I never documented any of it other than, you know, getting out the iPhone and putting some footage on the gram. So now I'm trying to put together my own sort of small independent, call it outlaw production team where I can shoot more content, you know, because I got plenty of stuff I can drive, whether it's my own cars.
True.
I've been able to get into some press cars recently that are not Porsches, which have been fun, but I'm not really creating any, I'm not really documenting them because, you know, I haven't found time to put together this team. So that's something that I'm working on. You know, a few things that I'd spoke about before. You guys are on episode 23 or 26, whatever it is, of the Road to Redline podcast, which came out of lockdown, I think. People had been saying to me, hey, you should do a podcast. And I've done a ton of them, whether it's Rogan or Smoking Tire or Leno or whatever it is, I've done a ton of them. But, you know, people say, oh, you should do your own one. Well, I'm still not there yet, but I started doing these IG lives, something that I'd never thought about pre-lockdown. Never occurred to me to do an IG live. And of course, you can do them remotely, right? So that was kind of like the test for the potential podcasts I'm trying to put together. But the interesting thing about the IG live is they're not car-centric. I've done them with Michelin 5-star chef Andrew Carmelini. I've done them with artists. I just did one with Gordon Murray. I did one with Ian Callum. So for me, these are great things that actually came out of adapting to this new environment, for me sort of staying at home, so to speak, and just back on this creative wave that I don't think would have happened for me during this period if it wasn't for this pandemic that we're in. And I think there's a lot of people getting creative, adapting to this new environment, coming out with things that they probably always wanted to do, but never had time to get around doing. So that's sort of what I've been up to the past 5 months, really.
How do you find that those IG lives have gone then? Because there is a few people starting to do those now on a regular basis, popping up on all of our Instagram feeds, you know?
It's interesting. It started out with my buddy, Phil, Mr. Enthusiast, Phil Toledero, the guy who I borrowed his Lancia Bastardo to make the big Apple Outlaw video. I used to hang out with him in New York when I was there quite a bit. And he's an interesting guy, got great taste in cars, watches, art, he's quirky. And he's the guy that said we should do a podcast together. And I was always like, how are we going to do it? We're never in the same place together. And finally, like middle of March, we go, hey, let's just do one of these Instagram lives. And we called it Geezer Talk. And people seem to like it. We rambled on about whatever, you know, Group B rally cars and trying to get pizza in New York. So for me, it was engaging. It was enjoyable. It was a way to occupy my time. And probably the turning point in the car world was I did one with Ian Callum early on, probably in April. And I've known Ian a little bit, met him at Pebble Beach a few years ago and did some drives with him when he was at Jaguar. And the interesting thing about the Ian Callum one was once I did that, within 48 hours, I had people at Porsche wanting to do them, Porsche Museum and Andy Prillinger wanting to do them. And it was almost like, wow, people are watching these things. And they just slowly started building. I did one with my buddy Mittia, that's a chief designer at Lamborghini. I did one with Steve Saleen. And then ironically, I did one with Scott Dixon, the Indy racer, and he's managed by Stefan Johansson, who this is actually his hat. And after I'd done that one, Stefan Johansson, ex-Formula One driver, reached out. And then ironically, people just started reaching out, like the Gordon Murray reached out to me, or his PR team did like the day after he launched the T50, which to me was like, just came super organically, but in reality was kind of a big deal. Like the day after he launches the latest, greatest supercar, right? I'm doing an IG live with him. So back to the organic element. It's not like I'm pitching people, hey, you want to do a live together. It's kind of the opposite way. It's coming to me. And I think what it is for me is it's allowing me to sort of naturally develop my craft of interviewing people. You know, I don't have any background in journalism or anything like that. Everything I do is sort of ad-libbed as I go along, unscripted. And that seems to work for me in that pattern. So, you know, I think something will come out of that, whether that's the catalyst to the podcast or whether I somehow figure out how to pull them off IG Live and stick them on my YouTube site as a IG Live/podcast type of thing. But ultimately, I enjoy them. There's no schedule to them. They're completely random. Last week I did 3. This week I'm not doing any. the largest viewed one that I've done so far was last week was the Israeli guy, Tomer, who did the 15-minute illustration. I don't know if you saw that, but I essentially drove into his studio and he painted a 8x10 portrait of me live in the studio in a little over 15 minutes. And that one's got over 60,000 views. So I think part of the goal there is you have to be engaging. Sometimes people get bored of two geezers just yakking on. I've noticed sometimes when you show more cars, you get more views. But to me, there's no method to it. It's not like, oh, let's go find a guy with a bunch of cool cars to get more views. I just talk to people that I'm interested in, whether it's Ferrari, Lamborghini, Jag, Porsche, or whatever. So that's kind of the story with the IG Lives. They're enjoyable, great way for me to meet people, build my rapport, and stay creative.
Stay social in these weird times.
Yeah. I mean, strange times, you know, out here in California, every area is different. You know, I talk to my mom once a week on FaceTime, ask her how it is there in England. You know, she's, you know, seems somewhat unaffected in one hand because, you know, she's got an older boyfriend who's 82 who lives out near Bakewell and it's kind of rural.
Yeah.
But California, you know, sometimes it just seems normal. Like there's a lot of people out there driving around. I mean, it's the new normal, right? You can socially distance in a car behind you with no one around.
Absolutely.
What gets me are the geezers that are in a Prius on their own with the face mask. And I go, right? No one's around you.
There's a few of those over here as well.
We've got those, I think.
Actually,
you touched on a Prius.
We're
Everybody
stay safe. You know, I'm always carrying the face mask around. I'm having fun making them. You know, here's a cool little one right there. So, you know, I've always got them in my pocket, my US American one. But yeah, you adapt to the new environment. Life goes on. We'll all get through this on the end, hopefully, with some new exciting developments, creatively wise at least.
I was going to ask Magnus, everyone we've spoken to out there in LA seems to have a little electric car squirreled away. Are you in that camp? Have you got something electric as a town runabout, or are you not there yet?
No, I'm not there yet. I mean, I've driven them. I've driven the Taycan. It's what I call high voltage rock and roll. Time will tell. You know, let's not forget I'm the geezer that just bought a 45-year-old, 147 horsepower, 304 V8, unloved American. I'm not even going to call it a muscle car because, you know, with 147 horsepower, there's no muscle there. But to answer your question, no, I don't have an electric car. I'm all mostly vintage. Depending where I'm going, I go in phases. My daily driver recently has been my 78 928 just because it's practical, it's quirky, it's fun to drive. I do have that awesome 992 Aventurine Green 7-speed manual Porsche that I've had for a week. So Hannah gets a lot of press cars that I'm able to drive, usually high-end luxury stuff that I'm not necessarily too interested in, but I like driving them. So there's always a lot of diversity, whether it's new press cars or old stuff, but there's nothing electric here yet. But I think you got to adapt to the future. I think there's a time and place for everything. I think something like a Taycan is great because they're fast in the hills, even though you got to watch the range. But I think where they really come into handy is commuting, right? If I worked in Santa Monica, it's an 18-mile drive, could take an hour. Makes perfect sense to commute in those cars.
Absolutely.
You know, as for a spirited drive up your favorite road or, you know, putting 500 miles in a car in a day, that's where the challenges or restrictions come with range on electric vehicles. And let's not forget, the faster you drive those cars and you don't touch the brake, they don't regenerate power. So I used almost 40% of the Taycan's power driving from this warehouse to Newcomb's Ranch, which is 42 miles away.
Good work.
That's a
You're
good
not
effort.
touching the brake when you're going uphill. It sucks that battery range down pretty quick.
We were out on the Purbex the other night in a Taycan, and range anxiety was big, wasn't it?
Yeah, we got to like 6 miles on the way back.
And we were going to get the ferry across, which is cuts out a 20-mile drive. And we were like, shit, is the ferry actually going to be on? Because it's been a bit dodgy lately.
Well, the other thing as well, if you run out of gas, you can get your mates come along with a jerry can and chuck some fuel in the car. But what happens when you run out of charge? Like, you just, you know.
A really long extension lead.
Well, one of the great things about the past few months is Hannah and I have done a lot of these, call it 300 to 500 mile drives in an afternoon. Where you just go, and maybe this is a California thing, but you can certainly, like, you know, let's take the scenic road to Palm Springs and make it a 300-mile drive. And we've done it in like 4 or 5 hours, including all the photo stops and stuff like that. You can't do that in an electric car because you can't do 300 miles. And where are you
Yeah.
going to stop, in the middle of, you may not find a charging station up a mountain type of thing.
Yeah.
So I think at this point, those cars are great for urban city commuting with a short range little blast. I mean, there's no denying the fast. They don't even bother me. I mean, what actually bothers me about the Taycan is not the lack of true noise. It's the artificial piped in noise I find more irritating than the noise of the tire squealing, the rock chips, and the suspension. Why make it artificial? And then if I'm going to rant, why call a Taycan a turbo? And there's no turbo badge on it, right?
Yeah.
This is literally our
turbocharged
conversation last
forcing
week.
induction of an internal combustion engine. How does that fit a Taycan? But yet that awesome 992 Carrera S that I have, which is the turbo, non-turbo, right? They don't put a turbo badge on the turbo 911 unless it's top of the range turbo S. But yet no one seems to mind them putting it on a Taycan because when you ask them, they go, well, it just represents luxury in the top of the line, and that's why we're calling it a turbo. But it's a little bit like, Essex boys in the 80s sticking turbo badges on the hot hatches, right? Kind of the same thing, but it's false advertising. So that's my rant with that particular flavor of turbo, non-turbo.
We're with you on that one, definitely.
Yeah. Well, look, while we've
A lot
warmed
of
you
people
up,
are, it's like, how do they get away with that from a marketing point of view?
Yeah.
while we've warmed you up, Magnus, I want to chat to you about 993s because I remember chatting to you on your book tour a couple of years back when you come over here for it. I think somebody asked you a question in a Q&A and said you've not got a 993 in your collection yet. What's your opinion of 993s? Andy owns one, by the way. and I remember you saying at the time, it just doesn't dig it for me. Obviously, you've got one now. So what changed, and kind of post-drive, post-ownership, what's your thoughts?
Well, it's interesting that you say that. Ironically, just today, my buddy Johnny Lieberman, who's the writer for Motor Trend, sends me a little blurb. His review on the Gunther Works 993 came out, and he quotes me in Motor Trend articles saying, according to Magnus Walker, it's the Cadillac of 911s. And I always said that it's the Cadillac of 911s, in stock form, and not that I'm a stock form guy because most of what I have is modified in some way, but I just never clicked with the 993. I got close to buying one from a few buddies, and every time I drive them, they always sort of felt a little soft, hence the Cadillac of 911s. It felt a little delayed. Everything seemed a little numb. They seemed a little floaty. They weren't razor sharp. They weren't necessarily fast. They were fast, but I thought I'd buy one and never drive one. And then ironically, my buddy Robert Angelo had that Riviera blue one that he sends me a little DM on the gram, or I see a post on the gram. I'm thinking of selling it. And so, of course, I get excited about it. I got to ask him, how much do you want for it? He says, well, let me drop it off for,
That's right.
You can have it for a few days. And he drives it in, and the front bumper's kind of half hanging off, and the window's not going down, and there's a few issues with it. And I'm like, it's another sort of slippery slope project. But the more I drove it, the more I started to like this car. And it sort of started an RS sort of lightweight type of build. But when it first came, I thought it was paint, but that Riviera blue was a wrap. So that was another thing. It's wrapped. And I've always been anti-wrap. Everything that you see around me is paint. So that sort of, ticked it against it. But the more I drove it, the more I kind of liked it. It was engaging. It was faster than the other ones I'd driven. It wasn't shockingly fast, but it was just fast enough to sort of be engaging. Anyway, we struck a deal on the way low end of the market because that was the other issue is I'd kind of missed the 993 boat where they were sort of what I would call affordable. And everything that I've acquired has been affordable because I've got them before they became, trendy or doubled and tripled in price. But anyway, we agreed on a price on the low end of the market and then ended up doing that art car, which we might as well go take a look at it.
Yeah.
You've got to figure out how you turn things around on Zoom. Let me see if I can do this. So let me turn the lights on in the garage. We'll take a look at it. Right there. So, my goal here was to do this sort of art car project, which started out really easy. I just literally got out some paper tape, 1/2 inch, 1 inch in like black, yellow, white, and just started taping on. So that came really quick. I like this sort of 80s, almost United Colors of Benetton livery.
Yeah.
You know, my
Isn't
goal
it?
was not to do something that had been done before. You know, I'm kind of way over these. Let me show you my Martini livery this or my Golf livery that. The goal here was to do something that I hadn't seen being done before on a 911.
Yeah, see,
And
how
then
did you come up with that? I've never seen anything remotely similar to that. I remember it popped up on my Instagram feed. There's no other car like that.
Truth be told, I started getting inspired by not that Brumo strobe, but the turbo strobe on an early turbo that would have said turbo on the rear quarter there.
Oh,
Yeah.
That
that's
was
cool.
the beginning inspiration. Then, of course, I was slightly inspired by my GT3, which was just a modification of a Brumo stripe.
Yeah.
But literally, I started with a box of tape like this. You know, these are, in fact, the tapes that I used on the car right here.
Yeah.
And so that whole, I don't know if you saw the video that I did, but it was another, you know, sort of stay-at-home COVID type of thing where I was just sat out there taping on, taping off, and then I made a little video of it. But to answer your question, I just started running this line from the front here all the way to the back, and then I'd go in with the paper tape and just slowly build it up as I went along.
Yeah.
And I had a lot of fun doing it. The tricky bit actually was when I realized, oh, paper tape's not going to last. I got to find a graphics guy who can do the graphics part of it, right?
Yeah.
So I found a buddy, recommended this guy, Vader Works, and he was great, but he was used to doing a lot of SEMA builds, you know, and those guys would just send him some sort of Adobe file or Illustrator file, you know, and he would stick it in his computer and print it out and then just do the vinyl application. This was tricky because everything that you see on the car, the side strobe was the tricky bit because obviously it doesn't go straight, there's a slight flare to it. He had to recreate that himself. And then obviously we just did the vinyl applique together. So for me, it was a learning experience. It was something that I might not have done before a wrapped car, but as the car was wrapped to begin with, essentially all I did was a vinyl application. You know, but I've done these sort of, you know, colorful color schemes before. So it wasn't necessarily something that was, it was a different application, but it was a very creative process. So essentially that was the story behind that 993, which was really a follow-up to the 914 art car.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which was a pretty interesting collaboration between the guy I bought it from, Felix. I essentially bought that because of the door. That, you know, the car was all silver with that yellow door. And that inspired me to do this sort of mod livery / Britpop type of thing on the car. And then the great thing about this was him and I did it together over literally 3 days, spent probably $500 on materials. This was all laid out the same way. I'll show you something that's kind of cool. One sec.
So is that in graphics or is that paint on that one?
What's that?
Is that graphics again, or is that paint?
No, this is all paint. So how I started out here was because I don't know Photoshop, I literally took a photo of the car and then got out my Sharpies and colored it in. Like those are Post-its on the roof.
Brilliant.
And then we just, Felix and I came down and we taped it all together. So we'd run tape, mask it off, and then get out the rattle can and spray it. So everything on this car is actually rattle can.